Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I know this is right at everybody's dinner time, but this is a presentation that I've heard several times throughout the community, or throughout the state here at different events we've been at. And these two guys up here have a wealth of information that we can all learn from, both from Ball State and Dave Terrell and Michael Hicks. And they've been working with mayors groups around the state for decades. And actually pretty big advisors too to the state legislature. So they do have a lot of great ideas. They do a lot of studying, bring a lot of facts to the table. And the conversation we're having tonight is a shift in how we look at how we attract businesses to our community and where we're going from there. So I'm going to keep my intro really short. They're going to give their presentation, and then after that we'll move into a little bit of Q&A if there's time. But thank you for coming.
Yeah, so I'm David Terrell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Communities Institute. I think we have a little bit of what we do, and this is Dr. Michael Hicks, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research. And really what we're talking about is we're going to introduce Ball State a little bit, but we're really going to talk about the fundamental changes that have been occurring in economic development. That's the crux of the talk. Mayor Stutzman talked about economic development and business attraction, but we're going to talk about how maybe we need to rethink that as a primary function in our communities, and why we need to think of that. And just a little bit about our shops. We are essentially co-located and co-administrative in a lot of ways, but we are the convergence of policy, practice, and research. ICI is the engagement arm. We do a lot of training, a lot of consultative work, strategic planning, and other types of planning, really out in the communities. Mike's shop is the research arm of that, and we inform a lot of the research that he's been doing the last several years. His shop does. His shop consists of 3 economists, including him, plus 1 sociologist and demographer. And because of the work that we're doing, we made the decision several years ago, because of the work we're doing, we really get into social issues, sociological issues. So it was one of the best decisions we made, was to bring in a sociologist to help us understand some things. And you'll see her fingerprints in a lot of the work that we're doing here. And on the policy side of things, Mayor Stutzman said we do advise a lot legislatively. That's more on Mike's side of the shop. Me somewhat, but our shop does a lot working with the administration, the Lieutenant Governor's Office, the Governor's Office on program development, that we influence policy that way as well. So that's us. So when we talk about economic development, this is really the crux of the issue. Have we heard this phrase before? We need jobs. How many have said this phrase? A lot have said this phrase. No one can argue that we need jobs. But I think what the question really is how we get those jobs into our community. And so what we have been challenging people in the last several years, and we've developed this talk, 6 years ago? And we've gone all over the state, as the mayor said, but we've also had national audiences, both in person and virtually. We've had this talk, and we start off with this. We need jobs, but the more important questions we need to answer in our own community is, why do we need these jobs? Why do we need these jobs? And invariably, it's not a rhetorical question, but I'm not going to ask you all this, but because I know what the answer is going to be. But a lot of people will say, they'll start off right off the bat, we need more jobs because it'll grow our population. That's number one. Job growth, in our minds, job growth equals population growth. And the other answer will be because of our tax base. Now, the first thing, I think we say it in here, the first thing we need to understand, Job growth does not equal population growth. Job growth does not equal population growth. In fact, jobs follow people. People live where they want to live. Jobs follow people. We need to understand that. In terms of tax base, way back in the day, there may have been some element of truth there because of the way Indiana's tax structure has been, especially local tax structure. But that all changed with property tax caps. And the largest source of revenue, pre-property tax cap, the largest source of revenue for local government was property tax. And that was about 90% of all local revenue pre-tax caps was property tax. Since that time, estimates are that that as a portion of local revenue has dropped substantially. And local income tax has risen quite a bit in terms of that proportion. Property taxes still are a huge portion, but other taxes, mostly local income tax, has risen and continues to rise. It's anywhere from 30% to 50%, depending on the county. 30% to 50% of all local revenues are not property taxes, and it's mostly income taxes. So that has shifted, and we're going to explain some of that along the way, why some of that has shifted as well. So the other reasons people, we need to grow our skill base. We need to do some other things along those lines. When we talk about what's stopping us, it's going to be housing. We don't have the skilled workforce. We need the educated workforce. We don't have the amenities to attract the people. And so we need to ask the question, if we aren't taking care of the things that are stopping us, what makes us think we're going to get the jobs if that's the way to do it anyway? Why aren't we working on the things that are stopping us to getting those jobs? And it goes back again to the population and population retention and attraction. So since that traditional model has developed, a lot has changed in our communities as well. We'll talk about the changing economies. We'll talk about the demand for changing conversations and changing demographics. Change has happened, but our model, fundamental understanding, and the model that we've been using traditionally just has not changed to adapt to the realities of our communities. So this is the traditional approach that we've been talking about, luring investments in jobs, putting our resources into that, maybe at the sacrifice of making other investments in our community. It's focused, it's very transactional, and it's based on the idea that I've already challenged, is that we need jobs. Again, we can't argue that we need jobs. It's how we get those jobs. It's not as transactional. It's not as linear as we want it to be. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Oh, by the way, this is a data-thick presentation.
We wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of attracting jobs, and not so much where it came from, but where it's gone. And I'll just mention at the outset, the idea that we would attract jobs through business tax incentives, a business environment's relatively new. It popped up in the South in the 1950s and 1960s. It looked effective at the time, but we don't know if it was the business attraction efforts of places in North Carolina or Georgia, or if it was the combination of the Civil Rights Act and air conditioning. And there's not a good way to know for sure what that was, but it didn't really appear in the Midwest until the 1970s or 1980s when we started losing factory employment. Our peak here in Indiana was 1973, and we started mimicking the activities of places that were far poorer, less well-educated than us, that looked like they were taking some of our jobs. But that's not really what was happening. And so what really was happening was something more fundamental to the economy. And I start out with this fancy term, capital labor ratio. It's the amount of investment, dollar investment in equipment in manufacturing per worker. That's the capital to labor ratio. and I adjust it for inflation, go back to 1947, and you can see how sharply it's risen up through about 2012. And the point here is that if you brought $1 million to Elkhart County in today's dollars, back in 1947 when we started first gathering this data, that would have been followed by 22 jobs in manufacturing. And today you're going to get 2, 3 jobs, maybe 4, with $1 million investment. So the incentives to bring in investment, the size of the investment has a much smaller effect than it used to. And this is a picture of it. And I just used tomato canning because it's ubiquitous across Indiana. There's 3 pictures here. The first one at the top, your top left, is of tomato canning in the 1920s. Low capital to labor ratio. So there's a pole barn, a few buckets, knives, sharpening stones, and benches and tables, and that's it. Fast forward 30 years, 40 years to the late 1950s, and you can see the capital to labor ratio has gone way up. And now there are far fewer people. They're not doing the tomato processing by hand. They're actually just sorting things on conveyor belts and sending them on to be canned and sent to your kitchen table. And then you get to the 2000s, and this picture for the 2000s, it took me several hours to find because I wanted a picture of a person in it. It's really hard to find a modern picture of a factory with a person in it. Do that at home tonight when you're sitting around on your computer, Google factory 1955 and then factory 2005. The 2005 ones are just all equipment. And so this is a modern canning factory, no people, very high capital labor ratio. That sort of plagues economic development. So when you hear big announcements, my favorite was in Fort Wayne, the GM plant there announced $1 billion investment. And guess how many jobs it created? 0. Wasn't adding any jobs, right? They're automating that line. Probably destroyed jobs somewhere else in doing that. And so the traditional efforts the tools that you would use to attract jobs aren't going to be very effective if you're just paying more and more and more for that capital investment to come along with jobs. And that's reflected also in the relocation of factories. This shows the annual relocation of factories of over 500 people. That's sort of the golden apple for an economic developer in a county. There's 3,144 counties. So if you just line them up from Auglaize County, Alabama, all the way to, I think, Zebulon, Wyoming, then what you end up with is one new factory of over 500 people coming to your county once every 60 or so years. Now, this county, this community, workers in this community have been exposed to more job growth in manufacturing, right? And we'll talk about whether or not that's really a great thing down the road. I was in an economic virtual conference this morning, and I heard Elkhart County called out because of the potential volatility of that. But keep in mind that growth in manufacturing jobs is a rarity around the country, even if you're in a county that actually has more factory jobs than you did a decade ago. And here's the real point. If you're trying to attract jobs to your community in order to grow your economy, then you're attracting something called a footloose job. A footloose job is a job that could be done anywhere in the country because the goods that are being produced there or the services that are being produced there are being exported outside of your region. The other type of job is a non-footloose job. Those are jobs, now they could go anywhere, but they have to be around people because people are their consumers and you're consuming them locally. So a movie theater, a restaurant, local public services, a lawyer's office, a university, those are things that are being consumed locally. So the U.S. has been a job creation machine for the past 50 years. We've created almost 100 million net new jobs. This is additional jobs since 1970. But we've created negative of those footloose jobs. So when you hear somebody talking about economic development and they're saying, we're trying to attract jobs, this, folks, is what they're after. It's this. We have not created a net positive manufacturing, logistics, back office, warehouse, or financial services job for more than 20 years. And this stunned silence is exactly the same reaction I get every time I show this slide. So the economic development efforts, those that are try to attract a factory to your community, are chasing this. They're chasing whatever residual of this might move, that might move. And your community has been a beneficiary of that in jobs. We'll talk more about those jobs here a little bit. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with chasing that. But if you're chasing this at the expense of growing this, you're making one of the most fundamental public policy mistakes that you could make in the 20th or 21st centuries. Let me just say that again. If you're drawing resources away from those things that people want to have in their community to attract jobs that aren't growing, you're making a fundamental public policy mistake of the 20th and 21st century. But that's not the only problem, right? The problem is even if you attract these jobs, you are still facing the inexorable pull of those fundamental economic problems that have caused us to have fewer of those jobs over the past 50 years. So let me just point out again, because a lot of people don't understand this. I told you what the year that manufacturing employment in Indiana peaked. That was 1973. Does anybody know what year manufacturing production peaked in inflation-adjusted terms? I think it was actually 2018 because we slipped into recession. That's the smartest answer to that question I've heard in a long time. Yeah, it's now, right? 2022 probably will be the next top manufacturing year in Indiana. But we're not going to do it with more people. We're already down 50,000 people from January 2019, which was our peak manufacturing year since the end of the Great Recession. Right? And so if you're thinking about what's happening in the economy this way, right, you need to think about what else could happen to it. So I'm going to show you, we did a study in 2017, Brookings Institution did a very similar study 2 years later that mapped all the occupations in the U.S. have been measured by their risk of automation. So we mapped those occupations down to the county level in each U.S. county. We were the first people to do that. And then there's another study that was done at about the same time that mapped every occupation's risk to foreign trade, and we mapped those to every U.S. county. And what we found are some things that are pretty amazing in all this, and I'll show you the maps in a minute. The first one is the risk of trade is across the board for all occupations, in part, or not all occupations, but all income categories. There's a lot of jobs that could be outsourced. But it turns out outsourcing of jobs has been a fairly small share of job loss in the U.S. So the job loss in manufacturing between, say, 1995 and 2010 was about between 75 and 90% due to automation, not due to outsourcing of jobs. So we've continued all of those years to be increasing our manufacturing production. We just did it with a lot fewer people. And the other thing is that automation in the reverse affects high-income categories very little. It's low-income workers that are at far greater risk of having their job automated, in part because high-income workers are far likely to have skills that allow them to adapt to the new technology and create their new job. It doesn't really matter what you are, but if you go around today to hospitals, there's a lot of physicians working on how to automate their jobs. They're gathering data for artificial intelligence, for diagnostics, and things like this. They're not worried about losing their job as a physician. Right? The people who are going to lose their jobs are going to be the people who are maybe doing the x-rays or preparing those sorts of things. And so then there are long-term effects of these labor market shocks. And here's the risk that this region and throughout the Midwest, on your left is automation risk, and on your right are trade risk, or offshoring risk. And you can see here we are. Offshoring, we're high, but that is only 28 to 30% of jobs that exist in this county could be offshored right now. In contrast, 2/3 of the jobs in this county could be automated using technology that was in commercial application in 2013. Let me say that again. 2/3 of jobs in this county are potentially offshoreable using technology that was available and being used commercially somewhere in the world in 2013. Right? This isn't the Jetson stuff. This is stuff that's happening right now. Oh, I'm sorry. That's technology, not offshoring. Right? So automation and technology are going to strip a lot of jobs. And how does this work? We don't automate people. A robot doesn't even automate people. We just automate tasks so that we have far fewer people that are demanded there. And in this county, any place that has a lot of manufacturing, a high share of manufacturing, is at some risk, but it also cuts across all kinds of other technologies that are applied to services and elsewhere. Does this mean that this is going to happen right away? No. But the risk is very real. And when people say, I know, but we assemble RVs here. RVs are really customizable, and it's really hard to make a robotic that will do that customizable work there. I just remind you that we landed somebody on the moon with robotics in 1969. It's a matter of cost, not technology. And once the cost of doing that gets less than the cost of hiring and providing health care and dealing with absenteeism, that's going to get automated. It's a ticking time bomb. It's the same ticking time bomb that this part of the state faced in 1950. It's the same ticking time bomb that we've faced in the loss of factory jobs throughout the industrialized Midwest, the Northeast, and much of Europe for all of my life. And I'm pushing 60. We don't know how many jobs will be lost, how many people will transfer. We know that there's great risk of shocks. And these shocks are, again, concentrated in those footloose jobs. We also know that even if you don't lose your job due to automation, that places that have more of the footloose type skills are at greater risk. So I have a colleague of mine, Amanda Weinstein at University of Akron. She was able to check the job skills in each U.S. metropolitan area over the past 40 years and put them into 3 different categories, the dominant of primarily intellectual tasks, social tasks, and motor skill tasks. And what she found was the cities with higher concentrations of jobs in these motor skill tasks had much higher unemployment rates and recovered from downturns much more slowly. The cognitive or the people skill tasks had a much more stable employment period over time. And so it's not just the risk of job losses that causes the volatility that you all are concerned with, right? So if you're living in Elkhart County, you know that anytime there's a downturn, people are going to visit here. The New York Times will be here. The Washington Post will be here. I know because they call me. And we're coming to Elkhart County to interview some folks. Can you tell us about the RV industry? But I don't think the volatility problem here is your big problem. Your big worry ought to be structural or long-term change in these areas. We'll talk a little bit about population. These are estimated population growth over the next 40 years. And this is this is done by the state demographer at IU. And his work has been pretty good. So you can see there's expected growth, right? In your county, you're expected to grow. This is a fairly large metropolitan county. And it doesn't seem like it when you walk around downtown or if you drive around it, but it's a fairly densely populated area and will continue to grow. Most Indiana counties aren't, so you're at some advantages here. And your advantages here from natural population growth and some in-migration. We'll talk about that in Goshen with the context of Goshen near the end of the talk. And just as I sort of wrap up my section here shortly and turn it back over to David, Americans, he made the scary proposition that people move to the places they want to live and the jobs follow them. And that shouldn't be scary to us, but so many people are afraid of that because it suggests that you don't have the policy tools to attract people to your community. You can't give them big tax abatements to a factory. They're not going to move there. That you have to do something different with that. And in fact, I just got a text from today, or an email today, from a guy in New York who studies these things, and he sent me an Elon Musk email who said, yeah, I'm moving my company from Palo Alto to Austin. I really would have liked to have moved my country from Palo Alto to Oklahoma, but I can't pry my people away from Palo Alto to Oklahoma. I can pry them away from Palo Alto to Austin. So it's cheaper for my company. I get a lot more tax incentives in Oklahoma, but I can't get my people to move there. And we asked people, the federal government in American Housing Survey, which was first done in 1972 and then followed up every 2 years, asked people why they moved. And there were a lot of predictable jobs. I retired and moved to Florida. I went to college. I graduated from college and took a job. I got married. And those are the typical answers that continue to be a big portion of the respondents. In 1972, we didn't ask anything about the local community. Why did you pick the home you have? We just asked you why you moved and then why you selected the county. And a quarter of all people said, I moved because I was following a job. That was about 25% way back here in the 1970s. And you can see it declined precipitously. So I haven't read the 2019 version of it yet, but it's hovering around 10% of jobs are moving. People are moving for a job. They're moving someplace for a job. So it's not true that people don't actually move to jobs. It's just such a statistically insignificant portion of the population that it's not measurable. It's not measurable in the aggregate data. So if you look at the unemployment rate last year, it doesn't predict people moving to your community. If you have a tight labor market last year, it doesn't predict it this year. And there have been just well over 24 studies that have said that. We didn't even think to ask people about local public schools until the late 1980s. The American Housing Survey was updated each year, and they added questions on schools and local public services. First, schools in 1984, it was about 12%, and local public services, 10-12%, right? And then between 2000 and 2013, it just exploded. Does anybody have any idea why that might have happened? Why would the 7 out of 10 respondents to the American Housing Survey say they chose their home because of schools and local public services? What's different in 2013 than 2000? Global job, we've created 20 million jobs since 2010. People were moving in that time period because now they could tell the difference between schools. They had something called the internet that graded schools and local public services, and No Child Left Behind, which published reports on every school. And I always tell people in 2001, you go to a website, every chamber of commerce in America said their school district was the best, was a fabulous school, one of the best in America. I know I moved in 1999 to a really bad school corporation that I had to move from when my then 10-week-old turned 5. If you looked at the Chamber of Commerce website, it was the best school in America. It wasn't. Right? So people were able to see that data difference, and that's not going to go away. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to David, who's going to talk a little bit about the qualitative research and what that means for your community.
So we have really talked about the economic angle, but then there is that sociological angle, which we really need to dig into to help us understand maybe how to approach things differently. But it reinforces the quantitative analysis, the economic analysis that Mike Schaap has done. And we take different data sources and resources, and This one is from a Harris poll that tracked both millennials and boomers, and at the time, and I think still millennials and boomers are by far the largest proportion of the workforce, except then boomers were still the larger portion, but now with retirements, millennials are now the largest portion of our workforce. But our folks, I mean the folks in the survey, 68% believe the best way to improve the national economy is through local investments and to make communities attractive places to live and work. Local investment. To improve the national economy, it's local investments in community. And 65% believe that investing in schools, transportation choices, and walkable areas is a better way to grow the economy than business attraction. So that's what the general population believes as well. And this was, I'm not going to read through all of these, but this was a study done by University of Wisconsin that did a real comprehensive survey of the folks, the citizens in Wisconsin, about the 5 most important qualities of community. And I want to reinforce what Mike said, that people might move to a state or a region because of a job opportunity, but they're going to pick your community for these qualities. And that's the challenge that each of our communities have, is attracting and keeping that population. But these are all really somewhat predictable bullet points, but the last 2 we see are becoming more and more emergent in terms of engagement. The next to last bullet point talks about a small town sense of community and civic engagement. Hang on to that as I introduce another study, I think the next slide. But then the other one is proximities to cities that offer employment, entertainment, and shopping. So this introduces the idea of people are okay with regionalism. Your community doesn't have to be all things to all people. That you do have to have these things available, but if someone feels compelled to want to leave the community, that proximity to other communities is great as well. And I think that's a huge advantage for this area, for folks in Goshen, and because of your proximity to other urban areas, it's pretty easy to get around. The engagement one's not there yet. Well, let's talk about regionalism. Again, this is Indiana specific, and statewide, Indiana is at a huge advantage because compared to other Midwestern states, because we're not a big state geographically. I actually live in Madison, which is on the Ohio River. I drove up here today. It was 4.5 hours. So from end to end, it's not that big of a drive. That's a huge advantage. And we actually, Mike's shop did this research for the regional cities legislation. You're in a regional cities region, right? Yeah, you're in a regional cities region. So you understand the impact that can have. But I think this kind of caught us off guard with this research, that most population is not growing in urban areas. But the big thing is all of Indiana is within 45 minutes of an urban center, and more than 95% of all Hoosiers live less than 30 minutes away from a metro area. You're in a metro area. And so but parts of your county, other parts of the region, you're at an advantage there with being Goshen and Elkhart and Goshen together, because you are that hub for this community surrounding. Now I'm going to talk about place attachment, that next to the last bullet. Place attachment is a strong emotional bond to a community, and we do know that strong place attachment correlates for that community's GDP growth and population growth. We can't say there's a causal effect, but we can say there's a strong correlation. And we also know that folks that have strong place attachment are much, much less likely to leave their communities, even in times of economic downturn, people will want to stay in those communities. So what constitutes place attachment? So Knight Foundation did this huge study. It took, they surveyed 43,000 people in 26 cities over a 3-year period. And what they found was these are the components of the ranked components that people see are important elements of place attachment. One is social offerings, the other is openness, and one is aesthetics. And when we talk about openness, there's a connectivity between social offerings and openness. Openness means transparency and transactional transparency in government and other things. It also means people are free to get engaged. They're encouraged to engage in the communities. That means the volunteer opportunities aren't held tightly by the core 10 people in the community, that there's empowerment throughout the community. And it's that strong sense of community that these are the elements. And the last one is aesthetics. And what our research we're getting into is this idea that traditional economic development really hangs on to the idea of the finances of a community and the wealth of the community. But we also see that there are other wealths in a community. And we call them the comprehensive wealth. And we say there are 8 capitals, and here's the list of the capitals. And these have just as strong an influence on the population and GDP and productivity of a community. And Mike's research and his research team is really jumping into that. And I think the next 2 slides, and we're just scratching the surface on this research. The next 2 slides I think Mike wants to show about.
So you can see that the work that David's talking about and the data that I've shown are pointing towards this idea that quality of life, something other than the traditional business attraction methods, are playing a role in community growth. And so what we've done is we studied every county in the U.S. and we've tried this sort of dual proposition. So we don't know how to measure quality of life easily. Each of us have different preferences, or we have different preferences in our households. We negotiate to see where we move and where we live. But what we do know is that markets reveal something about what people like and desire, what preferences are available. So we can look at 2 markets. The first one is housing markets. And we looked at every U.S. county. And what we'd like to do is compare an identical home in each of the we like to have the price of an identical home in every U.S. county, because the home that's more expensive is valued by consumers, buyers and sellers, a little bit better than the other places, right? And a place that has a low cost of living is undervalued or is valued less by markets. So how do we do that? Well, we can't find an identical home in each U.S. county, but we can create one statistically by controlling for all the things we know about it. The number, we can look at the average home price, and we can look at the average size of homes, their composition, the year they were built, and what's the vacancy rate, what's the derelict building rate, all those sorts of things. And we create statistically identical homes, some of which are highly valued by consumers, and some that are low valued. The higher the value that's unexplained is really that unexplained value is a measure of quality of life as measured through homes. And we have to do the same thing for labor markets as well, because people are making these choices between where they want to live and what's available to work there. And we'd like to take an identical person and put them in every U.S. county, but we can't do that otherwise. We just can't do that. And we know that if we could, the person who would take a little bit lower wage, just a marginally lower wage in a place they want to live, and if they had to move to a place they didn't want to live, they'd have to take a higher wage, right? These are called compensating variations for jobs. So we create a statistically identical person in each U.S. county by controlling for educational attainment, the structure of occupations and industry in that county, the average age, other demographic factors. And in the places where the wage is a little bit lower, those are places that people are willing to take a little bit less income to move to. And places that have a little bit higher, unexplained higher wage are places they don't want to go to. And again, a really high wage place isn't what we're looking for. We're looking at that can't be explained by the characteristics of the people or the jobs there. And the way I like to use the example here, because everybody gets the housing example, that's location, location, location. When I first moved to Muncie, my neighbor is an IU Health manager, and I asked him how the job market was doing there in Muncie. He said, it's horrible. We have to pay more to get someone to move to Muncie than if they live in Carmel, if they're a physician. That shouldn't surprise anybody if you visited Carmel or Muncie. So we put these two together and we get something called quality of life. It's really the difference, right? So, and here, quality of life, we're looking here at the sample. These are micropolitan communities in the United States on your left-hand side. And what we see is that as quality of life goes up, that's on the horizontal axis, population growth is positive. It's not huge, right? But we're talking about small variations in quality of life driving rather significant population change over time. And this is just micropolitan areas. We also have that for metropolitan areas and dozens of samples. I just got back from Texas 2 weeks ago showing it to them, showing that people are actually moving to the high tax places in Texas because they have high quality of life. But if you reverse the two, you have a quality of business environment, right? So the businesses are willing to pay more for people and more for property in more productive places. That's the central lesson of productivity, and that quality of business environment is not correlated with population growth. And so these are 2010 measures of quality of life and 2010 to 2017 population growth. But the funny thing about this is that's population growth. And you could say, oh, well, yeah, of course, people are going to live where they want to work. But the strength of the relationship between quality of life and jobs growth is even stronger. It's about twice as strong. So businesses are moving to those places where they think workers are going to be. And believe it or not, businesses are going to have a better sense of what those places are than workers because they're going to have sophisticated mechanisms for trying to figure out where people want to move. And so high quality of life places are job attractors. Let me just say that again. A high quality of life place, as measured on this tool, is a job attractor. A low quality of life place is a job deflector. And it turns out that quality of business environment doesn't have any correlation, no statistical correlation with job growth. So if you want to attract people and jobs, it's really quality of life that's driving it, this complex idea that people are choosing a place to live because they like it, and that the challenge is on communities to ascertain what that is that they like. So I'll turn it back over to David.
Yeah, we kind of talk over each other's slides because we also do this individually, but we like tag teaming better. So this really leads to this whole idea of this new approach to economic development. We really call it community economic development. It does involve more engagement, and we talk about different kinds of resource allocation. I want to make clear that we're not against business attraction per se. But we are clear that these decisions need to be thought through in terms of resource allocation. And it might mean different kinds of discussions with the private sector, both existing community businesses in the community or potential businesses coming in. And now I think it requires understanding the types of investments that the community makes for the community, for the population. And we're actually gravitating more toward this idea when we talk about community development. We're talking about developing the community for the people in the community, for your folks right now. And both Mike and I get a little bit frustrated at this idea of talent attraction. Talent attraction is kind of a buzzword right now, and it's the idea that we need to bring all these talented people in. And if I were in a community and there's this discussion of what do we have to bring everyone in, it's kind of like, well, what about us folks? And the whole idea is building the community as best it can be for our folks. That's what builds a place attachment, and that is what makes the community attractive to anyone. And that, to us, to our way of thinking, that should be the goal, is building a community for ourselves, for the people who are here. And that includes an openness, and again, that makes you more attractive than this transactional idea of talent attraction, which is like business attraction. But again, you might have an opportunity for a business, and we're not saying don't do incentives. We are saying have the right conversations about resource allocation across the community and where those investments should be. And that should be a takeaway on that. But at the end of the day, people want quality places, and I think we've demonstrated what a lot of those characteristics are. So here, we've actually gone over all of these things. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll just leave these here for you to read through. I don't want to go through each bullet. I will highlight the idea of the Footloose jobs. People will relocate to amenities writ large. And we've talked about the resource allocation, that last bullet. Here are some things that we don't know is happening. Again, we don't know the pace of automation. We do know automation is going to happen. We don't know the direction. We didn't talk about the impact of COVID very much, but that's really changed a lot of how we look at our workplace. I think a lot of people have discovered that working from home is a viable option, and a lot of companies have rethought that policy, which makes the commute a lot more viable. Why don't you talk about that? That's something we've not talked about.
Right, so one of the critical issues in where people live is quality of life and the attachment to jobs as well. But if you de-link the job value or that you have to have locally with the community, then you can choose anywhere. Now, we don't think most people do that. We think that there's a good study by McKinsey says about 20% of jobs are going to be performed remotely, about 20% of work. But a big chunk of that's 2 days a week or 1 day a week locally or in the office, or 2 to 3 days a month in the office. So with the exception of a very small share of the population, you're still going to drive to work once or twice a week. But the idea of driving an hour, hour and a half to a job once a week is a lot different than commuting to and from a job an hour and a half every day. And so it opens up a much broader geography. Ironically, it makes quality of life far more important than it has ever been. So today, as we come out of this COVID recession, or at least the downturn at some point, the locational options for people are going to be more flexible than they have been over the past 2 or 3 decades. And so the tough news for communities that aren't prepared is that people are going to start moving out of your community if it doesn't have high quality of life, because they no longer have to be here for the job they have. They're going to go to a school corporation that they want to, they can afford a home and move away. If you're a good community, then you're likely to see some population growth if you're a place that a lot of people already find attractive. The good news for everybody is that it's going to take a generation or longer for that to adjust. And I compare people in my office. I work with exclusively younger people than me. That's what happens when you become a full professor. And so the people who are just out of school that work for me, have young children, they're not moving. They've already moved to their suburban place in an expensive home in Fishers, and they're splitting the job between Indianapolis. They're not going to move somewhere else because they already have a home and children there. Those students that I have are in college now, the graduates and undergraduates. They're now thinking about changing some of their career options so they can remotely work. So there are people actually changing from like marketing to accounting, which is a higher incidence of remote work, so they can choose where to live. And this is going to play out for a long time. It took more than 30 years for the baby boom to change housing markets. It's going to take another generation for this to play out here. So I'll hand it back over to David.
So these are just final questions to ponder. I'm just going to read through. I'm not going to read through all of these. And then Mike has some Goshen specific and Elkhart County specific data points to go through. Key questions, though, are how do we engage the community in an ongoing, meaningful way? Alignment between our vision and our approach. And just that basic understanding of community economic development versus just the traditional economic development. But these are questions I think every community should ask of themselves, and individually and as a community. Mike?
All right, so we want to talk a little bit about Goshen and Elkhart County. Just point out this is a forecast, this is a mechanical forecast of employment growth after the COVID recession. It's going to take a long time to catch back up. In the U.S., in terms of employment, we have between 5.5 and 6 million fewer people in the labor force today than we did in February of 2020. So these are people who've moved out. Indiana's share of that's well over 100,000. And so if you're an employer and you're trying to find people, it's tough to do with a lot fewer people who want to work. And why have they done this? They've retired, they're engaging in child care duties. This is disproportionately women. Of the 6 million, 4.5 million of them are women, right? So we think they're probably engaged in child care responsibilities that fall disproportionately on women. So we think the employment growth is going to take well to the end of this decade to catch back up where we were in early 2019. And again, Indiana was effectively in recession before COVID. We were in recession in the winter of 2019. Our employment peak was January of 2019, mostly because of the trade war that erupted at that time period. And so you're not looking at a quick turnaround here. That's just not going to come. Hopefully this is really wrong, but there's no evidence. As I saw today, I just sat through several economic forecasts today by the top economist at KPMG. There's really nobody who's predicting a full employment turnaround for several years. And so it's going to be a long slog back to normalcy. And here in Elkhart County, I think it's important to look at the type of jobs that you've been growing here. This has been a problem that's plagued Indiana in recent years. Let me just first tell you what's happened here and then talk about what's happened nationally. These are employment from the quarterly workforce indicators across 4 different education categories for people 25 and older. All right, so the blue are less than high school graduates. And yes, that includes Amish households, which you'll have quite a few here who typically don't attend high school. The orange are high school graduates with no secondary education beyond that. The gray are people who have either attended college or have an associate's degree. And that's not the same thing, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't separate them very effectively. And then the bachelor's degree here are the yellow lines, right? And so you can see that really since the end of the Great Recession, the big job losses occurred in this category, and we're not back to where we were 20-some years ago, and these data are lagged. So this is as of second quarter 2020, so it looks particularly bad, but we're not back up to where we were. Right? These data have not been published for third or fourth quarter yet at the county level. So what you have seen here in Elkhart County are significant job growth in some pretty at-risk jobs, right? The strong job growth in those college degrees, which are more insulated from automation, have not been very many. Now let me scare you a little bit by give you just a quick rundown of how this has worked out nationally. Since 1998, when this data is available, the U.S. has created about 30 million jobs for college graduates. About 4 million jobs for those with an associate's degree or some college, and negative jobs for people with only a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma. So if I were to throw up the U.S. graphic here, it would have the yellow line swamping all the other job creation. And that should shock you, because if you're in a community that doesn't have that going on, you're at significant risk. The non-college jobs are just not growing nationally. And they're not growing because those jobs are being replaced by automation in large numbers. Now, are all of them? Certainly not. There's the majority of any one group of people that work in the country today are high school graduates. The second question might be, well, how many of these college jobs are people who have a master's degree in puppetry and are working at Starbucks? There are some in there, but I will point out that the average wage growth in each four of these categories, the growth of wages of the college jobs outweigh all of the other three combined. So if the growth in college jobs are really coming at the expense of job quality, if these workers are really underemployed with college, then wages would be dropping in that, because we don't pay a master's degree in puppetry working at Starbucks any more than we do with somebody with a bachelor's degree at Starbucks. So this is a real factor that's going to play in to your community, and every community. Indiana looks very much like this, that the job growth quality is starkly worse than the nation as a whole at any time in the last 30 years that we have really good individual data on this. Now let's talk about some home prices. These are a home price index from sales of similar homes, identical or similar homes, over the past almost 40 years now. And you can see Elkhart has very closely tracked Indiana. We've looked very similar, and this, by the way, is up until, it's actually 2021, it's last spring when we started seeing the big price spikes. But we did not participate in the huge boom that occurred in 2005 to 2007, and then we didn't really participate in the big bust that occurred between 2008 and 2009. These are Goshen City data. These are data actually from the school corporation, the Goshen School Corporation, and I did that because the census looks at the school corporation, not the city borders, which have changed rather frequently over at least the decades prior to changes in the state law here. You're not a large city, but I want to point out a couple of things about you that are starkly different. The vacancy rate in Indiana of owner-occupied homes is about 13%. You guys are 2.4%. That's more like Annapolis, Maryland, Alexandria, Virginia, right? That's turnover. I'm sure there are homes here that you would wish were demolished, Mayor, and that are blighted, but you have an extraordinarily low homeowner vacancy rate. The rental vacancy rate is a little bit higher, but 5% is astonishingly good. I've talked about housing since we published a study in 2019. I tried to throw some cold water on the idea that there's some broad worker housing shortage in Indiana. Housing markets work really well. There's not a housing shortage in Indiana statewide. This is a tight housing market here in Goshen City. People want to live here and are buying homes, right? This is the MLS listing, right? So I did this in an adjacent community here a few weeks ago. I pointed out realtors are good people. They are very sensitive to quality of place, but they also don't take low-valued homes as listings. And so you can go to a place like Muncie, right? And I'll pick on the community that I live in Delaware County. They have, low double-digit homes for sale right now in a county of 117,000 people. And you'll hear the realtors complain about a housing shortage. The same week that the sheriff's sale had 1,400 unsold homes. Right? So the typical community this size in Indiana would have well over 1,000 vacant homes. Well, closer to 2,000 vacant homes. And you have single-digit homes, just turnover homes. So you do have housing issues here in Goshen, significant housing issues. I wanted to talk a little bit about home value distribution, and this is just sort of, these are homes, a small number of homes at less than $50,000, 500 or less. The bulk of homes, 3,000, some are in that $100,000 to $150,000 range. Right? I view this for a Midwestern town as a very healthy distribution of home prices. And when I was in Elkhart recently, I was not optimistic about theirs is relatively unhealthy. When I talk in Muncie, it's very unhealthy. They're in the less than 50,000. They have 5, 6, 8,000 homes. 5,000 of them are vacant. So that's a city that's smaller than Elkhart, Goshen combined. These are rental costs as a share of income, right? And so these are 1,000 households with less than 15%. You have a little over 1,000 households that are paying over 35%. And I circle that because that's sort of the threshold of poverty. When you're paying about a third of your income in housing cost and rental cost, that's you're right at the edge of poverty in those areas. So you have housing stock needs across the board. So when folks talk about a housing shortage here, that's something to think about. It's for real here. I don't like the word shortage. It has a very particular economic term, but there is a housing need here. In part because people are moving here, which is not true in most municipal places in Indiana. These are monthly help wanted ads, and they're on 2 axes right here. This is the total. This is in Elkhart County, several hundred a week, a big jump this spring. I don't know who advertised for a lot of jobs, probably one of your big employers, but averaging 500, 600 jobs a week. New job openings. And then I wanted to show this because the mismatch between the help wanted ads and the number of people working is maybe partially explained by this. This are help wanted ads that ask for remote employment. So I can search on them in my little database. And you can see it was really low. It was 2-3% of jobs up until the pandemic that were advertising for remote jobs, and now it's been hovering at the 10% range. And one of the things I think that's exacerbating the sense of a labor shortage is that a lot of your workers are taking jobs remotely, and so the jobs being counted in California or Palo Alto or Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., or Boston, but the people are here, so they're working. And there's been an explosion of part-time remote jobs that pay fairly well that would allow many people who have childcare challenges to stay at home and work part-time and earn back a lot of the income that they would have been able to clear after paying for childcare. So the same challenges that make it hard to staff a Burger King make it hard to staff a childcare facility. So childcare is very expensive. And so I have a niece that lives in David Terrell's town of Madison, Indiana. It's $12 an hour for her child care for her baby. And she and her husband earn $18 and $24 each at a local establishment, decent money in Indiana. But she's clearing about $5 an hour after child care and FICA, and then she's being taxed at their joint tax rate. So she could stay home, not pay child care, and work on an online business, just doing customer service 4 to 6 hours a week and clear that gap between child care costs and what she was taking home each week. And that's happening to a lot of your workers, which is why I think there's such difficulty getting good data on where people are working. I just wanted to show you a shift share in this county. A shift share is a way you take a look at your community and say, what's happening with employment by different sectors? And we look at three different things. We look at the actual historical growth. This is 2010 through 2020. How much that growth should have happened if you had grown at the national rate. How much of that's due to the fact that you have more or fewer jobs in that sector, and then how much is due to local competitiveness, some idiosyncratic characteristic of your community. Folks, you're growing factory jobs at just a stunning rate over that time period. This is the longest recovery in U.S. history. If you were growing at the national rate, you should have had 3,400 jobs. And so you've done very well in those Footloose jobs, manufacturing, wholesale, right? And then you've grown some other things that come along with more people and more jobs in these sectors. These are the growth industries. These are the nearly static ones. These are the ones that really haven't changed very much. Fewer than 1,000 jobs in construction, transportation, accommodation, leisure, hospitality, tourism sectors. And then here are the shrinking jobs. My only concern with this is that, some of these are things that probably contribute to quality of life. So Goshen and Elkhart County, I'm hopeful in this recovery that you recover more like at the national rate. And I know that the employers here are working very hard to fill jobs so that the growth is more robust because people are buying your county's biggest export, which is RV and RV parts, right? Everybody wants that. That's one industry that was doing very well. It actually slipped into recession in 2017, 2018, 2019, and then we had to do social distancing. Everybody got an RV. And so I know it's been gangbusters here. Population growth is modest. You're growing more slowly than the nation, but faster than the state. And particularly in a state where about a little over half of all counties are actually shrinking. Home price growth has been at the state average. I suspect it's tighter than that if I could look at the homes here in just Goshen City, because those are tighter markets, much smaller availability of homes. And again, rent and home prices appear to me in the most recent census to be reasonable. I'm sure they're not reasonable now. I believe that there ought to be some consideration of how you would look at new housing, right? And that would probably be land use planning, infrastructure limits, and that sort of thing. You're still risk this two things that I sort of glossed over. The first one is bifurcating jobs, high-end and low-end jobs, well-educated, high-pay, versus less educated, low-pay jobs. Those tend to be growing nationally. You have more balanced growth here, but that balanced growth is not, it's going to be at risk if a shock to those at-risk jobs comes along, and that shock is automation. And again, many of the workers who are at risk of automation will have no good, viable alternatives locally that will appear from them. And with that, I think Dave and I will take whatever questions you have.
Anybody have any questions? Yeah, Richard.
Dr. Hicks, you've written quite compellingly on the importance of immigration, especially in the future of Indiana, and by implication, the importance of diversity. And you didn't really address that, but in terms of quality of life, there is a correlation between a higher immigrant population and greater diversity, isn't there?
Yes, there has been historically. That data is true, that you get more immigration in the United States is less from Northern Ireland and Wales, where my people come from, and more from South Asia, from Africa, and other parts of Europe. And so, yes, that is the case. I mean, there's a couple of dynamics. The first one is the legal immigrants in the United States tend to be they tend to be better educated on average than the incumbent population, right? And I work in a college of business in an economics department, and you can tell because we're about a third immigrants, just like every other one, and that tends to be where those are. Illegal immigrants tend to have lower formal human capital, but higher informal human capital. They walked here from Guatemala or El Salvador, so that they may not have more than an 8th grade education, but they have a lot of the entrepreneurial talent that fueled the growth in the Northeast in the 1880s, 1890s. And we're not really up to immigration levels that we saw, say, in 1910, 1920. We're nothing like that as a proportion of the population. What we do know is the second generation of immigrant children outperform that same generation of incumbent population. So the children of the South Asian immigrants in my community are going to outperform my kids on average, the kids who are native born that are living there. And so that's part of the allure. One of the advantages of immigrants, that immigrants are moving typically from places that have much lower quality of life than anywhere in the United States. And so they are less sensitive to some of the factors that may be keeping Americans from moving to our community. So I've argued in my argument for immigration, which is nothing novel, it's very difficult to find an economist who doesn't support immigration. My argument was if you're a place that feels like you're having difficulty attracting people due to quality of place, we can remedy this, and it's an old-fashioned remedy. The old-fashioned remedies do the same thing with immigration that Indiana did in the 1880s, the 1890s, and the early 1900s by bringing in folks to the community who are less sensitive to, the things that one might find objectionable, like the cold or whatever here.
Kind of adding to that, our sociologist Emily Warnell did a study on immigration in Indiana. And I don't have the numbers quite right, but of the counties, the rural counties that have lost population, I think she indicated there are 5 counties that actually grew in population because of the immigrant population, because of the immigrants coming in. And I think there were 17 counties that did show population loss, but any gains in population were because of immigration. And there are excellent examples in Indiana of communities that second generation has really stabilized the communities. And Logansport is a shining example of that, Cass County.
Anybody else have any questions?
I knew we weren't that good.
Over here.
When you were talking about college education and that those jobs tend to be a bit more stable, could you speak a little bit to the trades? Because right now it seems like we need so many electricians and plumbers, and they don't have a college degree, and they make a pretty good salary.
And that's absolutely true. That's a fact that if you're in a skilled trade, that I'm going to write a column on this in the next couple of weeks. If you're in a skilled trade, you're going to have stability, high income. You probably actually have a lot of informal human capital because you're dealing with people and that sort of thing. My son is looking to go to college. His best friend is going right into plumbing. And if I were to guess who's going to make more, my son wants to go to West Point, so he's not going to make a lot of money when he gets out. And his friend's going to make a lot more money over the next 10 years than my son. The problem is that there are 8,000 plumbers, 8,000 electricians, and about 16,000 carpenters. Those are the 3 big trades in Indiana today. Let's just say we're short and need 10% more of those each year. That's what, 2,000, 3,000 kids, right? About 45,000 kids each year in Indiana turn 19 not going to college. So the trades are a really great option for 2,000. So it's just the next 43,000 we got to worry about. And the most obvious occupational choices for most of them is going to be something related to college. It could be something that's fairly straightforward, early childhood education. Doesn't have to be a 4-year degree. It could be a 2-year degree with some training. So I'm not trying to get more PhD economists, but nationally we're well below the average here in Indiana of those high school graduates going into college, and it's going to bite us hard down the road when some of those jobs go away. And they're not going because they have some ready employment options in front of them. At least they think they do. So I'm all about, if a kid at 16 says, I want to be a plumber, I want to own my own business, if I could invest on that kid, I would rather invest in that kid than invest in the kid who's going off to college and just wants to get I want to study puppetry and economics. But there are still job options for those puppetry and economics majors down the road that don't exist for the kids that don't go to college. If we just don't have enough trades jobs to account for the 45,000 kids a year that are not going to college, many of whom could do just fine at some of our best institutions.
So you may be aware that there was a development announcement last week that got some national coverage, and that is that Amazon is building a distribution center in Elkhart County in 2 years. Some of us question whether the world's largest company needed a tax break in order to build here. But there was quite a spirited debate, and there still is, about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So what would be your perspectives on whether Amazon coming to Elkhart County, decent paying jobs, good benefits, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I'm a professor, so I'm not going to be that blunt. I can see why an employer would want to be here. You have a large population of people who know how to work. It's a lovely place to live, with the exception of snow for 6 weeks out of the year. This is an ideal neighborhood, dozens of ideal neighborhoods. You import into this county net of about 22,000 people every day to work. Let me say that again. You import about 22,000 people every doggone day to work. Why on earth would you use resources that could be deployed to improving schools, to mitigating housing shortfalls, to removing blight, to improving roads, to create jobs that are all going to be filled by 23,000 people, another 1,000 people coming from another community to yours? And by the way, when they come, you say, oh, that's right, we get the tax benefits. No, you don't. You just abated them away. The benefits get on the highway and go to another county because that's the local income taxes that go with them. So I'm a big fan of Amazon Prime, play with it all the time. I don't really think they need many tax incentives. And if they don't come here, I'm just going to say, I'm going to take 30 seconds and explain to you the best argument that a community like this should make. And I call it the Phil Fulmer rule. When I taught at the University of Tennessee, I was a grad student there, and Phil Fulmer was the coach. He had one of his players he recruited was a guy named Peyton Manning. Some of you have heard of him. And he would go to a recruit's home, and he would sit down there in their kitchen table, and he'd tell the recruit and his family, look, if you come play defensive end for me, if you come play running back, we're going to play for a national championship each of the 4 years you're there. I was going to say 10, that's Alabama. Each of the 4 years you're there, right? But if you don't come to Tennessee, we're going to play for a national championship each of the 4 years you're somewhere else. And so a community like this that has more jobs than you can possibly fill, you don't need to be attracting new jobs. Are these jobs likely better than other ones? Maybe so, but who is paying for those taxes? And look, the argument that tax incentives don't cost the community money are wrong. Either they take money out directly that they wouldn't have had, they raise taxes on other people, or they reduce the quality of public services because they're being distributed across more people. It's just a mathematical fact. And so I would argue that is always, for a community that's importing jobs, paying for new jobs is not likely to generate the benefits that you would like.
This speaks to the discussion first of all, it's very, 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 very hard in today's environment not to do those types of incentives. It's just incredibly hard. And we need to acknowledge that, because that's been the culture that, from a policy perspective, even legislatively, that's the culture that we created since probably the 80s, the late 80s. That's when TIF legislation actually began with the GM plant coming into Fort Wayne. And so we have this culture that's incredibly, incredibly hard to overcome. And we have to acknowledge how difficult that is on the local level. But we are seeing evidence, first of all, I don't know if it was full abatement or whatever, but we do know communities are negotiating harder not to give the house away. And I think those are good, tiny baby steps. But I agree with Mike. There comes a point, and I've been in discussions with mayors very privately. I will meet with them, and they will say, I'm going to meet with this company in an hour, and they're going to hammer me about my community, how bad it is, and how hard it is to attract people into the community and so on. And then they're going to ask me for an abatement. And they don't understand the disconnect. And that just kind of makes me angry. But we have built that expectation in, and we need to understand that somewhere we have to start that understanding. And then there becomes, especially the growth of warehouses, our citizens over time, an interesting community to watch now is Hancock County, eastern suburb of Indianapolis. We're getting citizen revolts against the Amazons of the world right now, because they are getting too many of these kinds of things being placed in their communities. And so there is a tipping point, but I think that's where we're not having that broad-based conversation across the community before these opportunities happen. So, but you're always stuck in that tough position, and we need to acknowledge that. Even though we think it's a bad idea, we need to acknowledge that political reality, to be honest. Back here.
We have this conversation in council quite a bit about whether, if you decide not to give your tax abatements, then you're deemed an unfriendly to business type of community. And we had a discussion last week about whether or not, if you don't give tax abatements, does that make it a better place? If you across the board just say you're not going to, then does that hinder your ability to get more businesses to come to you? And we've often talked about the fact that our community needs to diversify in its business and its manufacturing. And we recently just got another RV company coming in here, and it's caused a lot of conversation about the fact that we are dependent upon RV and how clearly it's not going to help us in the future. And so I don't know if I have a question, but necessarily a comment that I think that everything that you presented today solidifies the conversations that some of us have been having, that we need to change.
Let me turn that into a question. David's right. These are tough, difficult. I'm an absolutist on tax incentives. It'd be best if we didn't have them, right? But if that's also not realistic, right? And so some communities can do things that you can have that conversation with businesses up front, saying, don't, if you're asking for everything, don't come complain to me in 3 years that you don't get the workers you want. Let's go drive around the high school. Let me show you what your tax dollars would do in the high school, what they could do there. And they're actually, Indianapolis is actually doing a fairly good job with their TIF districts of turning money right back to the schools. So they get TIF money, and they realize their schools are a huge burden on their growth. So they're essentially using half of the TIF dollars to circumvent the apportionment to schools so they can rebuild schools. And so there are employers, the employer community needs to hear that we're using these dollars intelligently. And we think your profit's important, but let's think about it in the long run. And I'll be honest with you, the negotiations about that need to be made with CEOs higher levels, because you got site selectors who are threatening you, right? And then you have relocation specialists that in a company who are going to write you off. And those are very difficult things to get around. But if you can just start with, instead of just giving away everything, start with zero and work your way to it, and ask for concessions along the way that accomplish goals that they would like to see in the community as well.
I would agree with that. And sometimes I think part of the challenge starts at the local level. I don't see it as much anymore, but economic development, traditional economic development at the local level, performance metrics are based on those job creation issues and things like that, which reinforces the notion locally that we need to provide those types of incentives. I agree with Mike wholeheartedly. We don't have those discussions with the business community early and often. And I think having that discussion with the incumbent business community is an important discussion to have. We're not saying do away with tax abatement. You can use tax abatement and TIF to establish really important policies, and you suggested one right there is if there are types of industries that you think can really complement what you want in your vision for your community, I think you can justify maybe more aggressive incentives as opposed to the types that you don't want to have come in. But it requires that discussion, not only within the council, but with the community at large, to really understand what the give and take is in terms of resources. It's resource allocation that we need to talk about.
And this is a very, very important discussion that we're going to continue having, I'm sure, over the next probably year or two as we work through this. And want to thank both of you for coming out tonight. It is 7 o'clock here. But I'd like to say, too, that Goshen, we have a really good footing right now, and we want to make sure we don't lose that footing. If you look at the 2010 census to the 2020, we grew by about 3,000 people, a little under. That's not a huge growth, but it's a steady growth. And for the last 3 years in a row, our net assessed value has grown more than the state of Indiana's. So that's another good signifier that we're moving in the right direction. We're very fortunate for what past groups and leaders have done. Groups like La Casa and Hugenboom Nossinger, who have been building homes in our community for years. Mayor Mike Puro, who's sitting over here. I believe it was early 90s, mid 90s, he put in one of the first bike paths for the city of Goshen. And he had to fight for it. But we now have, I believe, 32 to 34 miles of bike paths. And just to give you an idea of how many people actually come to use those, the Mill Race Trail, I live right on that trail, and it's just nonstop, even through the winter. Now the crowds might downsize a little bit, but people really do enjoy those outdoor features. So there's a lot of topics going on. We're very fortunate to have so many different groups in our county here working with us, and appreciate everybody coming out tonight. And David and Michael, thank you very much for joining us and giving us all this information.